On the evening of November 14, 1953, the Silver Comet pulled out of Chicago's Union Station at precisely 6:47 p.m., carrying 87 passengers and a crew of 22, and over the next 72 hours, that train would become the most baffling disappearance in American railroad history, a case that would confound investigators, consume families, and eventually fade into the dusty archives of forgotten mysteries until the day it returned as if no time had passed at all. And to truly understand the weight of that return, one must first understand the train itself, a marvel of mid-century engineering and design, a stainless steel streamliner built by the Pullman Company at a cost of nearly $3 million, a train that had graced the covers of Life magazine and Railway Age. A train that had carried presidents and movie stars and ordinary families alike. A train that represented the very pinnacle of American progress and the romance of the rails. And on that November evening, it carried a cross-section of post-war America that read like a census of the nation's hopes and dreams. There was Robert Hendricks, a 42-year-old accountant from Oak Park, traveling to Los Angeles for a job interview with a major aerospace firm, leaving behind his wife and two young daughters who waved goodbye from the platform, his wife's voice still echoing in his ears as she called out, "Bring us back something special from California," words that would become a painful refrain in the years to come as she waited for a husband who would never return. There was Margaret Sullivan, a 67-year-old widow from Boston, making her first cross-country trip to visit her son who had recently moved to California with his new bride, a journey she had saved for 3 years, carefully setting aside money from her small pension, her suitcase packed with gifts for a grandson she had never met, a handmade quilt she had stitched over countless winter evenings, photographs of her late husband that she carried in a worn leather wallet next to her heart. There was the young couple, David and Alina Chen, both 24, on their honeymoon dressed in their finest traveling clothes, their faces still flushed with the joy of their wedding just 3 days earlier, their hands intertwined as they gazed out the window at the passing landscape, dreaming of the life they would build together, a life that would be cut short before it had truly begun. There was Thomas Bellamy, a traveling salesman in his 50s, carrying a heavy suitcase full of fabric samples for department stores up and down the coast, a man who had spent 30 years on the road, who knew every hotel and diner between Chicago and San Francisco, who could tell you the best place to get a steak in Omaha and the most comfortable motel in Denver, a man whose wife had long ago stopped expecting him home on any particular date, but who always called her from every stop, a ritual he had maintained for 3 decades, and on that night he never made the call. It was Colonel James Whitfield, a retired Army officer who had served in both World Wars and who, according to the last telegram sent from the train, had remarked to the conductor that he had never seen the sky look quite so strange, a remark that would later take on a sinister significance, because the colonel was not a man given to fanciful observations. He was a pragmatist, a man who had seen the horrors of war and had come to believe that there was nothing in this world that could surprise him. And yet something about that sky had unsettled him, had made him reach for his pipe and stare out the window with a furrowed brow, his wartime instincts telling him that something was not right. There were the 3 teenage boys from a Catholic school in Indiana, traveling to a youth conference in San Francisco, full of laughter and mischief, their chaperone a weary-faced priest named Father O'Malley who had been tasked with keeping them out of trouble, a job that was proving more difficult than he had anticipated, and he had already confiscated 2 comic books, a deck of playing cards, and a slingshot that one of the boys had smuggled aboard in his suitcase. There was the elderly couple, Albert and Rose Feinstein, celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary with a grand tour of the American West, a trip they had been planning for years, a trip that was supposed to be the highlight of their long life together, and Albert had purchased a new camera to document every moment, a fancy contraption with a flashbulb that he was still learning to operate, and Rose had packed a small notebook in which she intended to record their adventures. A notebook that would remain forever blank after the first page. There was the young mother, Patricia Morrison, traveling with her 4-year-old daughter, Emily, to meet her husband who was stationed at a naval base in San Diego, a reunion she had been counting down to for months, and Emily had drawn a picture of her father on a piece of paper that she clutched in her small hands, a crude stick figure with a smile and a hat, and Patricia had promised her that they would be together again soon, a promise that would go unfulfilled. There were the 2 businessmen, Harold Finch and Leonard Cohen, who had met by chance in the dining car and had struck up a conversation about the stock market and the future of the American economy, 2 strangers who would never finish their conversation. There was the young woman, Sarah Patterson, a nurse traveling to a new job in California, eager to start a new chapter in her life, carrying only a single suitcase and a small bag of books, her future spread out before her like an open road. There was the elderly man, Franklin Booth, a retired school teacher traveling to visit his sister in San Francisco, a man who had taught history for 40 years, who believed that the past was a fixed and knowable thing, a belief that would be shattered by what he was about to experience. There was the group of 4 friends, all veterans of the Korean War, traveling together to a reunion in Los Angeles, men who had seen terrible things and had come home changed, men who had promised to stay in touch but had drifted apart, and this trip was supposed to be a way to reconnect, to remember, to heal old wounds, and they had spent the first few hours of the journey sharing stories and laughing, but as the night wore on, something in the air had changed. A tension that none of them could quite name, and they had fallen silent, staring out the windows at the passing darkness. The train's crew was equally distinguished. The engineer was William Morrison, a 30-year veteran of the Santa Fe line, a man who knew every inch of the track between Chicago and Los Angeles, who had never had a single accident in his entire career, who was known among his colleagues as Old Reliable, for his meticulous attention to detail and his unflappable calm under pressure. A man who had been offered promotions to management positions multiple times, but had always turned them down because he loved the feel of the throttle in his hand, the rumble of the engine beneath his feet, the sense of freedom that came with hurtling across the American landscape at 70 miles per hour. The conductor was Arthur Klein, a railman of the old school, a man who had started as a brakeman at the age of 18 and had worked his way up through the ranks, a man who knew the names of every regular passenger on his route and who always had a kind word and a cigarette to share, a man whose logbook entries were the stuff of legend among railroad historians for their precision and their occasional flashes of dry humor, a man who took his responsibility to his passengers seriously, who saw himself not just as a ticket taker but as a guardian of their safety and comfort, and who had a sixth sense for when something was wrong on his train. There was the fireman, Robert Dawson, a young man of 26 who was still learning the trade, who looked up to Morrison with the admiration of a student for a master, who dreamed of one day having his own engine, his own route, his own reputation as a steady hand on the rails. There was the head porter, Samuel Jackson, a dignified African-American man in his 50s who had worked on the railroad for 30 years, who had started as a luggage handler and had risen to become one of the most respected members of the crew, known for his quiet competence and his ability to anticipate the needs of passengers before they even knew they had them. There were the cooks and waiters in the dining car, men who took pride in their work, who served meals that were the equal of any fine restaurant in Chicago, who had their own rhythms and routines, their own small dramas that played out in the confines of the kitchen car, their own friendships and rivalries that had developed over years of working together on the long cross-country runs. There was the baggage handler, a burly man named Frank O'Malley, no relation to the priest, a coincidence that caused some good-natured confusion among the crew, who had a reputation as the strongest man on the line, capable of lifting trunks and suitcases that would have broken the backs of lesser men, and who was known for his booming laugh and his endless supply of jokes and stories. There was the brakeman, Thomas O'Neill, a quiet man in his 40s who had worked the same run for 15 years, who knew every curve and crossing along the route, who had a habit of whistling softly to himself while he worked, a habit that had earned him the nickname, the Whistler, among his colleagues. There was the dining car steward, a man named Arthur Jenkins, who had a military bearing and a no-nonsense attitude, who kept his car spotless and his staff on their toes, who had a reputation for running the tightest dining operation in the Santa Fe line. There was the sleeping car attendant, a woman named Elena Vance, one of the few women on the crew, who had been hired during the war when so many men were serving overseas, and who had stayed on because she loved the work, because she loved the rhythm of the rails, because she could not imagine doing anything else with her life. There were the porters, the waiters, the cooks, the baggage handlers, all of them seasoned professionals who took pride in their work and who looked forward to the journey ahead, their lives intertwined with the lives of the passengers, their stories converging on this single night, this single train, this single moment in time that would become a legend. The Silver Comet departed Chicago on time, a fact that was noted with satisfaction by the dispatcher in the Santa Fe Control Center, and for the first several hours, the journey was unremarkable, the train making its scheduled stops at Joliet, Mendota, and Galesburg, each time taking on a few passengers and letting off a few others, the rhythm of the rails as predictable as a heartbeat. The last communication from the train came at 11:23 p.m. from a small station in rural Nebraska called Benson, a whistle-stop town with a population of just over 400, a grain elevator, a single diner, and a train platform that consisted of little more than a wooden bench and a rusted sign. And the station agent, a man named Harold Pembleton, would later become the key witness in the case because he was the last person to see the Silver Comet and its crew alive. Pembleton was a quiet, unassuming man who had worked at the Benson station for 31 years, and he remembered that night with unusual clarity because the Silver Comet was late. It was supposed to pass through Benson at 10:15 p.m., but it didn't pull in until nearly 11, and Pembleton recalled that the locomotive's headlamp seemed dimmer than usual, as if the train had been traveling through something that had coated its lenses with a fine grey dust, and when the train came to stop. The air brakes hissed in a way that sounded almost like a sigh, a sound that Pemberton would later say sent a shiver down his spine, because it seemed to carry a weight of exhaustion that no train should possess. He watched the conductor step down onto the platform, a man he had seen dozens of times over the years, Arthur Klein, who always had a cheerful greeting and a joke about the weather. But that night Klein seemed different, preoccupied, almost uneasy, his face pale in the dim station lights, and when Pemberton asked if everything was all right, Klein just nodded and said the train had picked up a strange passenger a few miles back, a man who had flagged them down from the tracks in the middle of nowhere. Which was impossible because the Silver Comet was an express train that didn't stop for hitchhikers. And besides, there was nothing but empty prairie for miles in any direction, no roads, no houses, no reason for anyone to be standing on the tracks at that hour, and Pemberton asked what the man looked like, and Klein said he didn't know because the man had boarded at the rear of the train and hadn't been seen since, which was odd because the conductor always checked tickets and accounted for every passenger. But Klein said he had tried to find the man and couldn't, and that the man simply wasn't on the train anymore, even though Klein had watched him step aboard with his own eyes, and Pemberton asked if the man had been wearing anything distinctive, and Klein said he wore a dark suit and carried a leather briefcase, nothing remarkable, but there was something about his face that Klein couldn't quite remember, as if the man's features were somehow indistinct, like a photograph taken out of focus. And Pemberton later told investigators that he had felt a chill run down his spine when Klein said that, and that he had offered to call the railroad police, but Klein had waved him off and said it was probably nothing, just a trick of the light or a tired mind playing games, and then Klein had climbed back aboard the Silver Comet. The train had pulled away from Benson, and that was the last time anyone ever saw Arthur Klein or the Silver Comet or any of the 109 souls on board. The train never reached its next scheduled stop in North Platte, which was only 68 miles west, and when the dispatcher realized the Silver Comet was overdue by more than 4 hours, a search was initiated that would become one of the largest in railroad history, involving hundreds of men, dozens of aircraft, and miles of track combed inch by inch. But they found nothing, no wreckage, no debris, no signs of a derailment, no smoke, no fire, no bodies, no luggage, no personal effects. Nothing at all except the tracks themselves, which were pristine and undisturbed, as if the Silver Comet had simply been lifted off the rails and carried away into the night sky. And the search was expanded to include the surrounding countryside, the rivers, the canyons, the vast open plains, and still nothing, not a single trace of the train or its passengers. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the families of the missing began to lose hope. But they never stopped demanding answers, and they hired private detectives, consulted psychics, filed lawsuits against the railroad, and even petitioned the White House for a federal investigation, but nothing ever came of it, and the official investigation concluded that the train had somehow derailed into a nearby river or had been buried by a landslide, but no river in the area was deep enough to conceal a train of that size, and there had been no landslides reported in the region for decades. And the families, desperate for closure, eventually accepted the official narrative, though many of them never truly believed it, and over the years the Silver Comet became a footnote in railroad history, a cautionary tale mentioned in training manuals and whispered about in crew lounges, a ghost story told by old railmen to new hires on quiet night shifts, and the case was officially closed in 1963, 10 years after the disappearance, with the notation unresolved. Probable catastrophic accident with no survivors, and the file was moved to the National Archives where it gathered dust for 7 decades, forgotten by everyone except the families who had lost loved ones and the occasional historian who stumbled upon it while researching something else. But the families never truly forgot. Robert Hendricks's wife, Alina, raised their 2 daughters alone, always telling them that their father would come home one day, that he was just on a long journey, and she kept his suits in the closet, his shoes by the door, his pipe in the ashtray on the mantel, as if he might walk through the door at any moment, and she wrote him letters every week for the first 10 years, letters that she never sent because she had no address to send them to, letters that she kept in a shoebox under her bed. Letters that her daughters found after she died, hundreds of them, each one more desperate and heartbroken than the last. Margaret Sullivan's son, Edward, never stopped looking for his mother, hiring private investigators every few years, spending his inheritance on searches that went nowhere, and he died in 1989 at the age of 73, still believing that his mother was alive somewhere, still hoping that one day she would walk through his door holding the quilt she had made for a grandson he never had. David and Alina Chen's parents, who had been so overjoyed at their children's wedding, were left with photographs and memories and a grief that never faded, and they spent the rest of their lives wondering what had happened to their children on that train, whether they had suffered, whether they had known what was happening, whether they had held each other in the final moments, questions that would never be answered. Thomas Bellamy's wife, Martha, waited for him every night for the first year, setting a place for him at the dinner table, keeping his coffee warm, and then she too stopped believing, But she never remarried, never moved on, never stopped loving the man who had promised her he would be home by Tuesday, a promise that had been broken by forces she could not understand. Colonel Whitfield's daughter, a woman in her 40s at the time of the disappearance, was convinced that her father had been killed by a conspiracy, that the government had been testing something on the train, and she spent decades writing letters to congressmen and senators, demanding a full investigation, but she never received a satisfactory answer, and she died in 1995, still believing that the truth would one day come out. The 3 teenage boys, whose parents had entrusted them to Father O'Malley, were mourned by a community that had come together in their grief, and Father O'Malley, who had survived the journey only to be consumed by guilt for losing his charges, spent the rest of his life performing penance, never forgiving himself for what he saw as his failure to protect them, and he died in 1980, still haunted by the faces of the boys who had been under his care. Albert and Rose Feinstein's children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories about their grandparents, about the trip that was supposed to be a celebration of a lifetime of love, about the beautiful wedding they had attended when Albert and Rose had renewed their vows, about the life they had built together, and they never stopped wondering what had happened, never stopped hoping that one day, somehow, their grandparents would come home. Patricia Morrison's husband, James, who had been waiting for his wife and daughter at the naval base in San Diego, searched for them for years, never giving up hope, and he kept Emily's drawing of him in his wallet until the day he died, a faded piece of paper that was the only thing he had left of his child. The businessmen, Harold Finch and Leonard Cohen, left behind wives and children and unfinished deals, their lives cut short in the middle of a conversation about the stock market, a conversation that would never be concluded. Sarah Patterson's family, who had been so proud of her for getting the new job, for starting a new life, waited for her to arrive in California, and when she never did, they searched for her, hoping she had just changed her mind and gone somewhere else, but they never found her, and they never knew what had happened to their daughter. Franklin Booth's sister, who had been so excited to see her brother after so many years, never stopped wondering why he hadn't arrived, and she spent the rest of her life looking for answers, writing letters to the railroad, to the government, to anyone who might be able to tell her what had happened to the brother she loved. The 4 Korean War veterans, who had survived the horrors of battle only to vanish on a train, left behind families who had thought they were finally safe, finally home, finally able to build the lives they had dreamed of, lives that were cut short by a mystery that would never be solved. And then, on the morning of November 14, 2023, exactly 70 years to the day after the Silver Comet had departed Chicago, the train pulled into Union Station at 6:47 a.m., on schedule as if it had never been gone at all, and the first person to notice it was a security guard named Marcus Webb, a man who had been working the overnight shift for 15 years and who knew every sound and rhythm of the station. And when he heard the familiar hiss of air brakes and the rumble of wheels on steel, he assumed it was a freight train passing through on the outer tracks. But when he looked up, he saw the Silver Comet sitting at platform 7, gleaming and immaculate, its stainless steel body polished to a mirror shine, its windows dark and unreflective, and Webb later told reporters that he had felt his blood run cold because he recognized the train from the photographs that hung in the station master's office. Photographs of trains that no longer ran, trains from a bygone era, including the Silver Comet, which had been hanging on that wall for as long as anyone could remember, and he stood there for a long moment, trying to process what he was seeing, his mind refusing to accept the evidence of his own eyes because it was impossible, because the train had vanished, because there was no way it could be sitting there, not after 70 years, not in the condition it was in. Not with its lights off and its windows dark, not with the strange stillness that surrounded it, a stillness that seemed to absorb all sound, all movement, all sense of time itself. Webb was a man who had grown up hearing stories about the Silver Comet, stories that his grandfather had told him, because his grandfather had been a railman too, a man who had known Arthur Klein and William Morrison, a man who had been scheduled to work on the Silver Comet that night but had called in sick, a decision that had saved his life and haunted him for the rest of his days, and Webb had heard those stories so many times that they had become part of his own memory. Part of his own identity, and now here was the train, the legendary train, the ghost train, sitting on platform 7 as if it had just pulled in from a routine trip, and Webb knew with a certainty that he could not explain, that something terrible had happened, that the train had come back for a reason, that he was meant to be the one to find it, and he felt a strange pull, a compulsion to approach the train, to touch its cold stainless steel, to peer through its darkened windows. And he took a step forward, and then another, until he was standing beside the locomotive, his hand reaching out to touch the metal. And it was cold, impossibly cold, as if it had been sitting in a freezer for 100 years, and he pulled his hand back and called the station master, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what he had found, and the station master came down to platform 7, saw the train, and immediately called the railroad police, who called the FBI. And within hours the station was swarming with investigators, all of them staring at the impossible sight of a train that had vanished 70 years ago, sitting on the tracks as if it had just completed a routine journey, and the first thing they noticed was that the train was pristine. Not a speck of dust, not a scratch on the paint, not a single sign of age or wear, the stainless steel gleaming as if it had just been polished, the windows spotless, the wheels free of any rust or corrosion. And when investigators forced open the doors, which were locked from the inside with a heavy chain and padlock that was later found to be of a type not manufactured since the 1950s, they found the interior in perfect order. The seats were upright, the tables were set, the luggage was in the overhead racks, newspapers from November 14, 1953, still crisp and unyellowed, a half-eaten meal on a dining car table with a fork resting beside a plate of food that looked as if it had been prepared minutes ago, a game of cards in the observation car with hands dealt and chips stacked, a child's toy on a seat, a woman's handbag on a shelf, a man's hat on a hook, and absolutely no people. And the investigators walked through the train in stunned silence, noting every detail, every personal item, every piece of evidence that spoke to a life interrupted, and they found wallets with identification, photographs, letters, jewelry, eyeglasses, even a set of false teeth in a glass of water that was still wet, as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment, and they counted the personal effects and matched them to the manifest, and every passenger was accounted for, every piece of luggage. Every item of clothing, every book, every comb, every pocket watch, every wedding ring, but there was one additional item that did not belong to anyone on the manifest. A small leather-bound journal that had been found in the luggage rack of the observation car, tucked behind a suitcase as if someone had hidden it there, and when they opened it, they found entries written in a hand that did not match any of the known passengers or crew, and the entries described a journey that was even stranger than the one recorded in the conductor's logbook, which they had also found in the conductor's compartment, and that logbook was a treasure trove of information, written in Arthur Klein's neat, careful hand, and the entries were unremarkable for the first several hours: departure from Chicago, stops at various stations, routine observations about weather and track conditions. But then at 9:47 p.m., the logbook contained an entry that made no sense: passed through tunnel, duration unknown. Sky changed, and the problem with that entry was that there were no tunnels on that stretch of track, not for hundreds of miles in any direction. The terrain was flat and open, and yet Klein had written that entry as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if he had simply noted a routine occurrence, and the next entry at 10:03 p.m. read, passenger count unchanged, still cannot locate the man who boarded near Benson. Conductor Klein and engineer Morrison both agree something is wrong with the horizon, and then at 10:22 p.m., the sky is wrong, the stars are not in the right positions. Morrison says we should stop, but there is nowhere to stop. The tracks continue, but the landscape is unfamiliar, and at 10:41 p.m., we have been traveling for what feels like hours, but the clock says only minutes have passed. The passengers are becoming agitated. Several have reported seeing lights in the distance that do not match any known settlements. I have tried to radio the dispatcher, but there is only static, and at 11:15 p.m., the man who boarded near Benson has appeared in the dining car. He is sitting alone at a table, not eating, not speaking, just staring at the window. I approached him and asked for his ticket. He handed me a piece of paper that was blank. When I looked up, he was gone. The other passengers in the dining car confirm they saw him but did not see him leave, and then at 11:23 p.m., arrived at Benson. The station agent does not seem to recognize us. I cannot explain it. We are stopping for water. The sky is the strangest color I have ever seen. I will send a telegram and then we will depart. And that was the final entry in the logbook, the last words Arthur Klein ever wrote, and investigators pored over those pages for hours, trying to make sense of the impossible details: the missing tunnel, the wrong stars, the sky that was the wrong color, the passenger who handed over a blank piece of paper, and they interviewed Harold Pembleton, who was still alive at 97 and living in a nursing home in Nebraska. And Pembleton confirmed that he remembered the night the Silver Comet had stopped at Benson, remembered the conductor's uneasy demeanor, remembered the strange gray dust on the locomotive's headlamp, but he had never seen the train again after it pulled away, and he had spent the rest of his life wondering what had happened to Arthur Klein and the 108 other people on board. And Pembleton told investigators that he had always felt in his gut that the train had not crashed, that it had not derailed, that it had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere that wasn't on any map, and now here it was, back again, as if it had just returned from a very long journey. And the FBI brought in specialists from the Department of Transportation, from the National Transportation Safety Board, from the Smithsonian Institution, from NASA, and none of them could explain how a train could vanish for 70 years and then reappear in pristine condition, with all of its contents intact and no evidence of aging or decay. And they ran tests on the food in the dining car and found that it was still fresh, the coffee still warm, the ice in the glasses had not melted, and when they tested the train's mechanical systems, they found that the engine started on the first try. The brakes functioned perfectly, and the fuel tanks were still 3/4 full, as if the train had traveled only a few hundred miles instead of 70 years into the future. And they examined the passengers' belongings and found that everything was exactly as it had been left. The watches still ticking, the photographs still sharp, the letters still sealed in their envelopes, and there was no evidence of any struggle, no signs of violence, no indication that the passengers had been taken against their will. They had simply vanished, and the only clue was the journal which they had found in the observation car, and when they read the journal, they discovered a narrative that was even more disturbing than the conductor's logbook, because the journal's author, who never identified himself, wrote about boarding a train in Chicago on November 14, 1953, and about the strange events that had unfolded during the journey, but he also wrote about things that were not in the conductor's logbook, things that no one else had reported, things that suggested the Silver Comet had traveled not just through space, but through time itself. And the journal described passing through a tunnel that was not on any map, a tunnel that seemed to stretch on for an impossible distance, and when the train emerged from the tunnel, the sky was a different color, a deep, unsettling shade of amber, and the stars were arranged in patterns that did not match any known constellation, and the landscape was familiar but wrong. The hills were in the wrong places, the rivers flowed in the wrong directions. The train's radio picked up broadcasts in languages that did not exist, languages that sounded like a human voice but with a strange, distorted quality, and the passengers began to notice that something was very wrong, and they started to panic, but the conductor tried to calm them down. And then people began to disappear, not all at once, but one by one as if they were being erased from existence, and the journal described watching a woman fade from sight while she was reading a magazine. The magazine falling to the floor as her hands became translucent and then vanished, and a man who was in the middle of a sentence when his voice trailed off and he was simply gone, leaving behind only an empty seat and a half-finished cup of coffee. And the author wrote about the conductor, Arthur Klein, who had tried desperately to maintain order, to keep the passengers calm, to find a way back to the world they had left behind, but nothing worked. And one by one the passengers disappeared until only a handful remained, including the author, who had hidden himself in the observation car and had begun writing everything down in this journal, hoping that someone would find it and understand what had happened. And the last entry in the journal was dated November 15, 1953, the day after the train had departed Chicago, and it read, "I am the last one. Everyone else is gone. I can feel myself fadding. The train is still moving, but I do not know where it is going. If you are reading this, please remember us. We did not abandon our lives. We were taken," and then the journal ended mid-sentence, as if the author had been in the middle of writing when he, too, had vanished from existence, and the investigators were baffled. They ran tests on the journal, on the train, on every piece of evidence they had collected, and they found nothing that could explain the disappearance of the Silver Comet or its passengers, and they began to consider the possibility that the train had been caught in some kind of time anomaly. A rip in the fabric of spacetime that had transporting it to another dimension, or perhaps it had been abducted by extraterrestrials, or perhaps it was all a hoax, an elaborate prank designed to fool the public, but they quickly dismissed those theories because the evidence was too solid, too consistent, too impossible to fake, and they returned to the one detail that had haunted them from the beginning. The photograph that had been found in the conductor's compartment, tucked into the pages of the logbook, a photograph that showed a group of people standing in front of the Silver Comet on the day of its maiden voyage in 1939, and in that photograph, standing in the back row, partially obscured by the train's smokestack, was a man who was not supposed to be there, a man whose face was familiar to every investigator who saw it because it was the face of Marcus Webb, the security guard who had discovered the train on that November morning in 2023, a man who was born in 1985, a man who had never traveled on the Silver Comet, a man who had no connection to the train or its passengers. And yet there he was, in a photograph taken 84 years before he was born, dressed in the clothes of a bygone era, staring at the camera with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite recognition, but something in between. Something that suggested he knew exactly what was going to happen, something that suggested he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. And the investigators immediately brought Webb in for questioning, and they showed him the photograph, and they asked him to explain how his face had ended up in a picture from 1939, and Webb stared at the photograph for a long time, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly, and then he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, I knew it would come back." And when they pressed him for more, he told them a story that was even more incredible than the train's return. A story about a man who had been born in 1985, but who had memories of another life. Memories of a journey on a train that had gone somewhere it was not supposed to go. Memories of a tunnel that had no end. Memories of a sky that was the wrong color. Memories of passengers who faded away like smoke. And Webb told them that he had always felt that he was not quite right, that he had dreams of a woman with a magazine, of a man with a half-finished cup of coffee. of a conductor with a kind face and a cigarette, and he had always felt a strange pull toward Union Station, toward the trains, toward the night shift, as if he was waiting for something, and now he knew what it was. He had been waiting for the Silver Comet to return because he had been on that train. He was the man who had boarded near Benson, the man who had handed Arthur Klein a blank piece of paper, the man who had watched the passengers disappear one by one. The man who had written the journal, the man who had faded from existence and then reappeared in a different time. A different body, a different life, but the same soul, the same consciousness, the same memory of a journey that should never have happened. And the investigators were skeptical, of course. They thought Webb was delusional, or perhaps he had been involved in some elaborate hoax. But they could not explain the photograph, and they could not explain the journal, which was written in a hand that was remarkably similar to Webb's own handwriting, though he had never written in that style before. And they could not explain the fact that Webb had been working the overnight shift on that exact date for the past 15 years, as if he had known when the train would return. And they could not explain the look in his eyes, a look of profound exhaustion, as if he had been carrying a terrible burden for a very long time. And they interrogated him for hours, but he never cracked, never confessed to any wrongdoing, never gave any indication that he was anything other than what he appeared to be. A night shift security guard with an unremarkable life and an unremarkable past. But the investigators who had studied the Silver Comet, who had read the logbook and the journal, who had seen the photograph, they knew the truth, or at least they suspected it. And they knew that the mystery of the Silver Comet was far from over, that somewhere out there in the vast, unknowable expanse of time and space, the train was still moving, still carrying its ghostly passengers, still traveling through that impossible tunnel, and that one day perhaps it would return again, and when it did, it would bring with it the answers that had eluded everyone for so long, or perhaps it would bring only more questions, more mysteries, more evidence that the universe is stranger than we can possibly imagine, and that some journeys, once begun, can never truly end. The investigators, led by FBI Special Agent Sarah Collins, a woman who had spent 20 years working cold cases and who had seen more than her share of inexplicable phenomena, refused to let the mystery die, and she assembled a team of experts from a dozen different disciplines to study every aspect of the Silver Comet's return, and they worked around the clock, examining the train's mechanical systems, analyzing the personal effects, conducting interviews with anyone who had any connection to the original disappearance, and they made several discoveries that only deepened the mystery. First, they found that the train's odometer, which measured the distance the train had traveled, read only a few hundred miles more than it had on the night of its disappearance, suggesting that the train had not traveled very far in the intervening 70 years, and yet the fuel tanks were three-quarters empty, which was consistent with a journey of several hundred miles, and the wear on the wheels and the tracks was consistent with a train that had traveled at least that distance. So where had the train been? And how had it traveled without being seen, and how had it returned to the exact same track without anyone noticing its approach? Second, they found that the food in the dining car, which had been analyzed by food scientists from the Smithsonian Institution, was not just fresh but appeared to have been prepared within the last hour, and the coffee was still hot, the ice in the glasses had not melted, and the bread was still soft, all of which suggested that the train had been in a state of suspended animation for 70 years, a state that was impossible to achieve with any known technology. Third, they found that the watches and clocks on the train, all of which were mechanical and required winding, were still ticking, and they all showed the same time. 11:23 p.m., the exact time of the last communication from the train, as if time had stopped on the train at that moment, and had only resumed when the train returned to Union Station. And they found that the newspaper on the train, the Chicago Tribune, was dated November 14, 1953, the day of the train's departure, and the articles in the newspaper were about events that had happened in 1953. Events that were now historical footnotes. And there was no mention of any of the events that had happened in the intervening 70 years, as if the train had been completely cut off from the flow of time. Fourth, they found that the luggage tags on the passengers' bags were still attached, and they bore the names of the passengers and their destinations, and when they checked the addresses on the tags, they found that many of the addresses no longer existed, that the buildings had been torn down or the streets had been renamed, and it was a poignant reminder that the world had moved on while the Silver Comet had remained frozen in time. Fifth, they found that the train's manifest, which had been stored in the conductor's compartment, was complete and accurate, listing all 87 passengers and 22 crew members, and the manifest included the names of the passengers and their destinations, and there was no mention of the man who had boarded near Benson, the man who had handed Arthur Klein a blank piece of paper, the man who had written the journal, the man who had disappeared into the void, and this was a significant omission, because it suggested that the man had not been a passenger on the train, had not been part of the official journey, had been something else entirely, something that had inserted itself into the train's reality and had then faded away, and this led the investigators to a chilling conclusion. The man had not been a passenger on the train, he had been an observer, someone or something that had been watching the events unfold, and he had inserted himself into the narrative to document what had happened, and he had written the journal as a record of the events, and then he had disappeared, leaving behind only his words and his photograph, a photograph that showed him standing in front of the Silver Comet in 1939. A photograph that proved he had been present at the train's maiden voyage, a photograph that proved he had been connected to the train long before it had vanished, and this raised even more questions. Who was the man? Where had he come from? How had he traveled through time? What was his connection to the train? And why had he returned to Union Station in 2023? Only to vanish again, leaving behind only his journal and his blank piece of paper, and the investigators searched for answers. But they found none, and the case of the Silver Comet became a legend, a story that was told and retold, a mystery that was debated and discussed, a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. But the investigators did not give up, and they continued to probe the mystery, and they discovered that the Silver Comet was not the only train to have vanished in that region, that there were 3 other documented cases of trains disappearing on that same stretch of track between 1917 and 1948, all of them with no wreckage, no distress calls, no explanations, and in each of those cases, the trains had later been seen, or at least reported, by witnesses who described them as ghost trains that appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye, and these cases had been dismissed as folklore or hallucinations. But now, in the light of the Silver Comet's return, they took on a new significance, and the investigators began to suspect that there was a pattern, that something about that stretch of track was unstable, a weak point in the fabric of spacetime, a place where the laws of physics broke down. And they brought in physicists and mathematicians to study the phenomenon, and they ran simulations and analyzed the geological data, and they found that the area was sitting on a massive fault line, a deep subterranean rift that had been dormant for millions of years. And they theorized that the rift might be generating some kind of electromagnetic anomaly, a field that could, under certain conditions, open a doorway to another dimension or to another time, and they set up monitoring equipment along the tracks, and they waited and they watched, and they hoped that the Silver Comet would return again, so that they could study it and learn from it, and perhaps, if they were very lucky, rescue the passengers who were still trapped in that impossible journey. But the train did not return, and weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and the case of the Silver Comet remained open, a permanent reminder that there are things in this world that cannot be explained, things that defy logic and reason, things that suggest that reality is not as solid as we believe. Marcus Webb, the security guard, was never charged with any crime, and he continued to work his night shift at Union Station, but he was a changed man, quieter, more distant, as if part of him was still on that train, still traveling through that impossible landscape. And sometimes, when he walked past Platform 7, he would stop and stare at the empty tracks, and his eyes would take on a faraway look, as if he was seeing something that no one else could see. And the other guards would exchange glances and whisper about him, but they never said anything to his face because they were afraid of what he might say, afraid of what he might remember, afraid that if they looked too closely into his eyes they might see the wrong stars, the amber sky, the tunnel that had no end. And then one night, 3 years after the train had returned, Marcus Webb vanished from Union Station without a trace, leaving behind only his uniform and his security badge and a single piece of paper on his desk, a piece of paper that was completely blank, and the investigators who had been following the case for years, who had never stopped searching for answers, they knew what it meant. They knew that Webb had gone back, that he had found a way to rejoin the Silver Comet, that he had chosen to return to that impossible journey, perhaps to find the passengers who had been lost, perhaps to finally understand what had happened to them, or perhaps simply because he could not bear to live in a world that was not his own, and they never saw him again. And the Silver Comet has not returned since. But there are those who believe that it will, that one day on some cold November night, the train will pull into Union Station once more, and it will bring with it the answers that have eluded us for so long, or perhaps it will bring only more questions, and the cycle will begin again. And we will be left to wonder, as we always have, about the nature of time, the fragility of existence, and the terrifying possibility that we are not alone in the universe, that there are forces at work that we cannot comprehend, that the world we know is just a thin veneer over a vast and unknowable reality, and that some trains, once they leave the station, never truly come back. The investigation into the Silver Comet's return continued for years, with the FBI and various other agencies pouring resources into the case, but they never found a satisfactory explanation for what had happened, and the train itself was eventually moved to a secure facility in the Nevada desert, a facility that was rumored to be connected to the military, a facility where the train was studied by scientists who were sworn to secrecy, a facility where the train's secrets were examined by the best minds in the country, and those scientists made several discoveries that only deepened the mystery. They found that the train's metal had been altered at the molecular level, that the stainless steel had been transformed into a substance that was stronger and more durable than any known material, a substance that had properties that were impossible to explain with conventional science, and they found that the train's electrical systems had been modified, that the wiring and the components had been changed in ways that were not consistent with any known technology, and they found that the train's engine, which had been thoroughly examined, showed no signs of wear, as if it had been used for only a few hours instead of 70 years, and they found that the train's air conditioning system was still running, and it was producing air that was inexplicably fresh, as if it was being filtered through something that was not of this world. And they found that the train's windows, which had been examined under high-powered microscopes, showed no signs of scratches or imperfections, as if they had never been touched by any human hand, and they found that the train's wheels showed no signs of wear, as if they had been newly cast, and they found that the train's paint was still as bright and glossy as the day it was applied, as if it had never been exposed to the elements, and these discoveries and many others led the scientists to a chilling conclusion. The train had been taken somewhere outside of time, somewhere where the normal laws of physics did not apply, and it had been returned to the same spot at the same time as if it had never left, and the scientists who studied the train were convinced that the Silver Comet had been the subject of an experiment conducted by forces that were not of this world, and they were determined to find out what had happened and who had done it and why. One of the scientists, a man named Dr. Thomas Chen, who had been brought in to study the train's mechanical systems, became obsessed with the case, and he spent years trying to unravel the mystery, and he eventually came to believe that the Silver Comet had been caught in a time loop, that the train had been traveling through time, and that the passengers had been lost in the loop, unable to escape, and he developed a theory that the train would return again on the same day in the same year, and that the cycle would repeat itself, and he spent the rest of his life trying to prove his theory, but he never succeeded, and he died in 2042, still convinced that the Silver Comet would one day return, and that the mystery would finally be solved. In the years that followed the Silver Comet's return, the story became part of American folklore, a modern legend that was told and retold, a story that captured the imagination of a nation, and it was the subject of books and documentaries and movies, and it was studied by historians and scientists and philosophers, and it was debated on television and in the press, and it was the subject of endless speculation and discussion. But no one ever found a satisfactory explanation for what had happened, and the mystery of the Silver Comet remained unsolved, and it was a reminder of the strangeness of the universe, and the limits of human knowledge, and the enduring power of the unexplained. The families of the passengers who had waited for decades were given some closure, at least in the sense that they knew what had happened to their loved ones, but they were still left with many questions, and they still wondered what had happened to the passengers, and whether they had suffered, and whether they had ever found peace, and they still hoped that one day, somehow, the passengers would return and the mystery would be solved, and they would be reunited with their loved ones, and they never stopped hoping. Because hope is the one thing that never dies, even in the face of the most unimaginable tragedy. And so the story of the Silver Comet continues, a tale of mystery and wonder, of loss and longing, of the strange and unexplainable, a tale that will be told for generations, a tale that will never be forgotten because some stories are too powerful to be forgotten, and some mysteries are too deep to be solved, and some questions are too profound to be answered, and the Silver Comet is one of them, a ghost train that vanished into the void and returned empty. A train that carried the hopes and dreams of 109 people into the unknown, a train that will forever be remembered as one of the great unsolved mysteries of American history, a train that in the end became something more than a train, became a symbol of everything that is strange and beautiful and terrifying about the world we live in, a symbol of the endless mystery that surrounds us, a mystery that will never be fully understood because some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. And that is the story of the Silver Comet, a story that will never end because it has no ending and it never will. And as for Marcus Webb, the man who had been born in 1985 and had lived a life that was not his own, the man who had returned to the train and vanished into the void, he has become a legend himself, a figure of mystery and speculation, and there are those who believe that he will return one day. That he will step off the train with the passengers, and that he will finally tell the story of what happened, and that the truth will be revealed, and that we will finally understand what happened to the Silver Comet and its passengers. But until that day, we can only wonder and we can only imagine, and we can only keep searching for answers, because that is what we do. We search for answers, we try to understand the world around us, we try to make sense of the inexplicable. And we never stop asking questions, because questions are the only thing that keeps us going, the only thing that gives us hope, the only thing that reminds us that there is still so much we do not know, So much we have yet to discover, so much that is still hidden from us, waiting to be found, waiting to be understood, waiting to be revealed, and perhaps one day the Silver Comet will return and we will finally learn the truth. And we will finally understand what happened to those 109 souls, and we will finally find the answers we have been seeking for so long. But until that day, we can only wait, and we can only hope, and we can only keep the story alive, because some stories are too important to be forgotten, and the story of the Silver Comet is one of them.